Macmillan Stewart Lecturer this year is Emmanuel Obiechina. He is a distinguished scholar and literary critic and is often sought after for his penetrating interpretations of African literature, poetry, and the African diaspora. Born in Nigeria, Obiechina received his BA in English from University College in Ibadan, Nigeria, an affiliate of the University of London, and his PhD in English from the University of Cambridge in 1967. With 20 years of teaching experience, Obiechina has taught students at universities in both the U.S. and Africa. From 2002 to 2003, he was a visiting scholar right here in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. He was a regular and incisive and delightful presence in our graduate seminar series last year, where he was also a visiting fellow in the Du Bois Institute and presented his work on slavery and the fall of Africa, textualizing a historic tragedy. In 2000, he was the Langston Hughes Professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Kansas, where he also delivered the Langston Hughes Lectures. Obiechina was also the first professor appointed to the endowed post of Forrest S. and Gene B. Williams National Endowment of the Humanities Professor at Ferrum College in Ferrum, Virginia. Obiechina has also held several senior-level management positions, including the director of a Nigerian University's office at the Nigerian Embassy in Washington, D.C., where he represented Nigeria's universities in the Americas and the Caribbean. His role there also involved coordinating educational exchange and faculty research interests and interfacing with the World Bank and many other world-class research institutions. Between 74 and 86, he held the posts of acting president, deputy vice chancellor, dean of the graduate school, and chair of the English department at the University of Nigeria. A festschrift has been done in recognition of his many accomplishments entitled Meditations on African Literature, edited by Dubem Okafor, and he's also received major grant awards for his Ford Foundation proposal on humanistic perspectives on contemporary society. And he's received numerous other recognitions, including a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellowship, fellowships at the University of Cambridge, and a Fulbright Fellowship for senior African scholars. Obiechina has numerous publications. These include Igbo Traditional Life, Culture, and Literature in 1971, co-edited with others. His African Popular Literature, a study of the Onitsha market pamphlets in 73. Culture, Tradition, and Society in the West African Novel in 75, and most recently in 2003, Mask Song for Our Times. I think the substance of his work deals with enormously important source material in a way, slave narratives. They're a powerful source of information telling a tale of human suffering, struggle, striving, and triumph for those who've had to go through the bitter gauntlet of enslavement and those involved in the industry that was built around it. And I believe we will find that his lectures reach deep into this rich well of voices of knowledge and experience. Emmanuel has chosen for his general topic for the Macmillan Stewart Lectures, Africa in the Soul, What We Can Learn from 18th and 19th Century African Slave Narratives. The title for his first lecture here this afternoon is Voices from the Whirlwind, How the Continent of Africa Was Severely Wounded. Please join me in welcoming Emmanuel Obiechina.
Thank you, Professor. This topic actually caught my attention as far back as 1979 when I went on a fellowship to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I came to it through African literature. I found that many of our literary critics constantly refer to slavery almost as a figure of speech in criticizing current, present-day African leaders. They always compare them to African leaders of the past who sold their kinsmen into slavery. It's just the highest mark of opprobrium if you tell somebody that, look, you're just as bad as those who sold their neighbors into slavery. But no African writer had actually, at that point, treated slavery as a full-fledged theme or done a piece of work with slavery in its center. But they use it always as a trope. And that always intrigued me. But later on, I stumbled at a collection of stories by the first generation African slaves in the 17th and in 18th and 19th centuries. And at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I said, let me investigate these stories and try to see if I can actually link them onto African writing, contemporary African writing. And that's the genesis of my lecture this evening, Africa is the Soul. I discovered that those Africans who told their stories were really Africans. They may have lived in England or may have lived in the United States, but they were at heart Africans, and they were responding to what happened on the continent. They lived in these new societies and actually integrated themselves within their new social environment. But at heart, they kept within them an aspect of their Africanness to the very end. And so my view is that if you're going to deal with African literature in totality, you've got to take them into account. They actually represent a very sizable aspect of African experience. They represent the collapse of the African social situation. This African culture and society collapsed during the era of slavery. Their evidence is essential in getting a full picture of what really happened to Africa. You can't get that. When I used to teach Things Fall Apart, which deals with the coming of Britain into a small Igbo community and how Igbo culture collapsed under pressure. I thought that was the entire story. In fact, it wasn't. The collapse was a long time ago. That's my conviction after reading these people. The collapse took place during the era of slavery. And I'm developing a theory of African fall, what I call the fall of Africa, which is like the fall of Eden, the fall of man. If you are a Christian, the Genesis story. What happened during the era of slavery is tantamount to what happened in Eden. That was the total collapse of a system. And I'm trying to build up this picture of the collapse. And there is no better evidence, collection of evidence, than the very words of the victims, those who were eyewitnesses, and those on whom the things happened those days, who were giving their own personal experiences. I think we can go to them to get a full picture of the fall of Africa, what really happened on the continent. And the continent has not recovered. When today we say that is the most unstable continent in the world, it's really because the continent has not recovered from the time of the slave trade, after that colonial period, after that the neo-colonial period, after that independent period, which is not really independent period. It's a series of collapses, and there has been no time for the continent to recover, to heal itself. That hasn't happened. But from just the talk I'll give this evening, you'll see the magnitude of the fall, of the collapse, where the social fabric itself just disintegrated. I'll read my lecture and then we can talk after that. Africa was a vibrant reality in the soul of our expatriate children during the era of the slave trade. a source of sensations in which memory was indistinguishably mixed with anguish. From the testimony contained in the narratives, memoirs, letters, and poems of those expatriate children, it is clear that the natal continent remained deeply etched in the consciousness, not always as something of pure pleasure and joy, but a part of themselves, a part of their emotional and spiritual existence, without which their integrity as human beings would have simply disappeared. This discussion is a review of the literature by the first generation of Africans who were able to tell their stories to determine what light it sheds on the destructions and upheavals of those tragic times. Attention is focused on texts which reveal insights into life and experience, and which through them clarify the true feelings of Africans at a time when other people were dissecting, analyzing, and defining them with godlike certitude. Most of the texts belong to the 18th century and a few to the 19th. Purely intellectual works such as the dissertations and tracts composed by African scholars nurtured in European universities are not discussed here for obvious reasons, nor are texts by Africans dispersed in other areas controlled by non-English speaking countries. The authors and narrators were compulsive storytellers. Whatever form they adopted, a letter, a memoir, or a poem, it soon took them to the storyline. Nor is this a matter of surprise, since the art of storytelling has always been the common heritage of the continent. And this is testified to by visitors to the continent, visitors ancient and modern. Each of the African expatriates whose work is being discussed here, except one of them, who was not actually born on the African continent. He was born at sea, and later on, but Africa remained his spiritual homeland. Well, each of them had attained the age of participating in storytelling sessions by the fireside, in the compounds, at the village arenas, or even at community gatherings, at which the different narrators, from simple raconteurs through ballad makers and minstrels to epic narrators and griots, regale the imagination with a sense of the magnitude, variety, and wonder of human experience. With so much of emotional and psychological weight to communicate, these dispersed African children reached back to a form already available to them, a form which they brought from their African base that had already become an aspect of their cultural personality, because it was engraved at the most impressionable period of their lives. They told their stories about themselves and their tragedies, not in the spirit of soliciting pity and sympathy, but mainly because self-dramatization had effects more significantly redeeming to the narrators than simple overt expectation of sympathy. They told their stories because the telling of them eased their pent-up feelings. Talking about their misfortunes had therapeutic effect by heightening the pressure upon the feelings, upon the heart. Most importantly, the reenactings brought forcefully back to the faculties a sense of the past, which, painful as it may have been, fulfilled the significant function of reinforcing their sense of human worth in the present. Like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, these dispersed children of Africa poured their tales into the ears of their audiences, who were compelled to be attentive by the peculiar authenticities of the tales themselves and the thrill and fascination of vicarious identification. Authentic tales of human misery are never without interest to people possessed of a fully developed sense of their own humanity. These tales, suffused with agony and suffering, were distilled from terrors so harrowing that there is nothing to compare with them in recent times, except perhaps the Holocaust. In the words of Eric Williams, the horrors of the slave trade exceeded everything before or since the world's history until the arrival of the concentration camps. The ingredients that compel attention are certainly present. Young children surprised and chased by faceless, malevolent strangers from thickets and glades that supplied cover for ambushes. The rough arrests, the furtive moves concealing crime, the manhandling of the victims, their being thrust or manacled and dragged away from home and community where they had identity, to the wide impersonal world where identity was lost and they sank into profound anonymity. If their enslavement followed from war, details of the confusion and insecurities also added narrative luster to the tales. The sufferings and agonies were no abstract terrors, such as those encountered in Gothic romances, but realities authenticated by experience, validated by their continuing relevance to the predicament of the slaves, and sanctified by the nightmares and tortures that remained the lot of the blacks in and out of slavery. The tales revealed the brittleness and precariousness of the lives of the dispersed Africans. Their sufferings went along with them as they continued to be cheated, harassed, browbeaten, and exposed to varied indignities and diverse inequities. Where the physical fetters of slavery were formally removed, the shackles of the mind and soul remained. The telling of the stories was the narrator's means of coming to terms with those realities. For their audiences, there were also redeeming aspects. The vicarious sharing of the sufferings of the Africans was one of the ways in which their audiences were given the opportunity to come to terms with their own guiltiness and complicity in the Africans' victimization. It was also a means of their experiencing a shared sense of humanity with those who suffered. For the narrators, the critical issue remained the misfortune of physical enslavement. Every one of them described the circumstances of his or her captivity, sometimes in detail, sometimes cryptically, but always with considerable passion, accompanied by regrets and deprecations, an indication that even after several years in bondage, and even after individual fortunes may have changed for the better on the surface of life, the wound in the soul remained fresh, active, and bleeding. Many of the narrators were victims of kidnapping rather than hostages from organized warfare. The idea that the slaves were weaklings who were sold by their stronger neighbors, or were criminals mercifully rescued from the jaws of death by the benevolent Europeans, is a fiction, well refuted by these narratives. The victims were often children or adults, surprised and seized surreptitiously. Olaode Ekwuano devotes almost the entire second chapter of his autobiography to his kidnapping. The attack on him and his sister was sudden and brutal. One day, this is Ekwuano now talking, one day when all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls and in a moment seized us both, and without giving us time to cry out, or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran with us to the nearest wood. Thus began an odyssey of misery, which would take brother and sister through the dense forest of Igbo land, down to the slave port of Bonny in the Niger Delta, to the West Indies, America, and Europe. Equiano was 11 years old and his sister even younger. For the Cape Coast Ghanaian Otoba Koguano, treachery was compounded with violence in the luring of children away from familiar haunts and woods, as, quote, several great ruffians came upon us suddenly and said we had committed a fault against their Lord, and we must go and answer for it ourselves before him. But the ruse was soon exposed as some of the youngsters attempted to run away. And, quote, pistols and cutlasses were soon introduced, threatening that if we offered to stir, we should all be dead on the spot. Violence and intimidation were twin strategies in the promotion of the institution of slavery. The deprivation of personal liberty was frequently brought about through coercive violence in one form or another. In a number of cases, the violation of individual liberty was itself part of a wider, more pervasive violence arising from warfare, including the Yoruba Wars of the 19th century, the Islamic Holy Wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, and the upheavals in the Ashanti Empire of the same period. These, though not altogether caused by the slave trade, were greatly reinforced and exacerbated by it. Some of the narrators who were victims of these conflicts describe the state of anomic violence in those times. It should be borne in mind, however, that the narrators were not historians, and that historical evidence was largely incidental to their central interest, which was to unearth the tragedies of individuals and communities caught up in the tumultuous events of the times, an interest which, as observed earlier, was both creative and therapeutic. Among the most illustrious of the narrators was Ajayi Crowther, the Yoruba ex-slave who became the first black bishop of the Anglican Communion in West Africa. He describes in language saturated with pathos the crumbling of his town in the aftermath of the collapse of the Oyo Empire. What followed the collapse was the all too familiar picture that was enacted all over West Africa: the spoliation of the fallen city, the capture of the defenseless citizens, confusion and turmoil as the unfortunate people attempted to evade the enemy's iron grip, calculated to leave no room for escape. As usual, it was the women and children who bore the brunt of captivity and enslavement. And here are Crowther's own words. Women, some with 3, 4, or 6 children clinging to their arms, with the infants on their backs, and such baggage as they could carry on their heads, were running as fast as they could through prickly shrubs, which, hooking their bellies, this word bellies, some people put it as bellies, but I suppose it's some kind of pidgin word, which means loads or bundles that people carry when they're running away. And other loads drew them down from the heads of the bearers. While they found it impossible to go along with their loads, they endeavored only to save themselves and their children. Even this was impracticable with those who had many children to care for. While they were endeavoring to disentangle themselves from the ropey shrubs, they were overtaken and caught by the enemies with a noose of rope thrown over the neck of every individual to be led in the manner of goats tied together under the drive. In many cases, a family was violently divided between 3 or 4 enemies who each led his away to see one another no more. And Crowther rather prosaically ends, "Your humble servant was thus caught with his mother, 2 sisters, one an infant about 10 months old, and a cousin, while endeavoring to escape in the manner above described." The scene is firmly set against the backdrop of the wider historical conflicts, but the drama is about individuals whose world was turned upside down and whose security was suddenly assailed, undermined, and obliterated by forces which they, as children and young people, only vaguely understood. Even more harrowing than the fall of Crowther's town, an event which was mercifully quick, after only 4 hours, was the collapse of Joseph Wright's city, Oba, which was surrounded and starved into submission by the Ijebu, who were at the time tearing down Egba cities and selling the inhabitants into slavery. Wright, in his stumbling but narratively effective language, leaves this pathetic picture of the destructiveness of those wars of rapine waged mainly to procure captives for the coastal slave markets. The city was taken about 9 o'clock in the morning. The enemies satisfied themselves with little children, little girls, young men, and young women, and so they did not care about the aged and old people. They killed them without mercy. Father knew not the son, and the son knew not the father. Pity had departed from the face of mothers. Abundant heaps of dead bodies were in the streets, and there were none to bury them. Suckling babies were crying out at the point of death, and there were none to pick them up. Mothers looked upon them with contempt. A lamentable day. The picture could not reflect a more complete overthrow of the natural order of things. The dead lying unburied in the streets, old people who normally would have been the object of respect, now exposed to merciless massacres and treated as trash, babies callously abandoned by their mothers. These were indications that the moral and social life of the region had crumbled. There were in West Africa, in the 400 years of the slave trade, those symptoms of instability, insecurity, and cultural disintegration, which European historians designated the Dark Ages of their continent. In Africa, the period of the slave trade could be regarded as Africa's darkest times, because during those centuries, the light of the continent's civilization went out. The cultures were emasculated, and the creative impulse in the people wilted away under relentless violence of armed roving bands, ambitious freebooting adventurers, and bloodthirsty generals propelled by the passion of material gains and lust for power. For 400 years, the flour and cream of the continent's population was wasted away. James Wright, like Crowther, Koguano, and millions of others before him, followed the long train in the midst of all the confusion until he was mercifully rescued by the British Naval Patrol. The upheavals in the Western Sudan, with their overlay of religious and dynastic rivalries, provided their own harvest of human misery, to which a number of narrators bear witness. Slavery was sometimes the lot of war hostages in the history of the Western Sudan, as the tarikhs and epics have shown. But the slaves were among familiar people, sharing a common way of life and fulfilling their human aspirations. The transatlantic slave trade radicalized and exacerbated the situation of those captives of the 18th and 19th century jihads. While the religious reformers were preaching regeneration and reform of life and religious practices, their less idealistic captains were organizing networks of mutually advantageous relationships with people worse than the apostates against whom the jihads were waged in the first place. The wars were against bad Muslims, but their victims, the Muslim captives, were paradoxically sold to the European slave traders, who had no respect for religion, morality, or decency. The line separating the struggle for the faith from the drive to benefit from the luxurious trade in slaves was not always firmly drawn. To present the matter differently, after the main force of the Islamic zealots had shattered the stability of the region without supplying adequate grassroots authoritative control, there existed a power vacuum which was exploited by armed bands that roved unchecked and turned the people's lives into nightmare. The stability and order about which ancient visitors to the region wrote so glowingly had ceased to exist. Among the narrators were Muslims literate in Arabic. Some of them were able to compose their narratives in Arabic, while others transmitted their narratives through a third party. The most illustrious of these was Ayuba Suleiman of Bunda, who was, like some of the others, a victim of an ambush. He was with an attendant on a commercial venture from his base in Senegal to the Gambia when he was grabbed. He had laid aside his gold-hilted sword, a gold knife, and his rich quiver and arrows, a gift, he said, that he received from King Samba of Futatoro, and was proceeding to refresh himself with his companion at a wayside inn when, and these are his words, a company of Mandingos who lived upon plunder, passing by at the time and observing him unarmed, rushed in to the number of 7 or 8 at a back door and pinioned Ayuba before he could get to his arms, together with his interpreter, who is slave in Maryland still. Both he and his interpreter had been captured and then, of course, sold. The bandits shaved their heads to make them look like war hostages and sold them to a Captain Pike, an English slave trader on the Gambia, who transported them on the 1st of March, 1730, to America. For Ayuba and his companion, descent into ignominy had begun. Abu Bakr al-Siddiq was a true war hostage from the Ashanti Wars. He was captured when the gold mining city of Buna, in which he lived, was overrun by Adinkra, the Ashanti governor of Bonduku, in his campaign to suppress the rebellion of Muslims in northwestern provinces of the Ashanti Empire. Abu Bakr describes his captivity with marked stoical detachment. On that day of the fall of Buna, they made me a captive. They tore off my clothes and bound me with ropes, gave me a heavy rope to carry, and led me to the town of Bondaku, and from there to the town of Kumasi, where the king of the Ashanti reigned, whose name is Osei, as Osei Tutu. From there through Achisuma and Ajumako in the land of the Fanti to the town of Lago near the Salt Sea, all the way on foot and well loaded. There they sold me to the Christians, and I was bought by a certain captain of a ship. For Abubakar, the dreary journey into slavery had begun. Omar ibn Said's narrative is brief, but its import is the same tragedy of the waste of individual at a time of massive upheavals. There came to our place a large army who killed many men and took me and brought me to the great sea and sold me into the hands of the Christians, who bound me and sent me on board a great ship, and we sailed upon the great sea a month and a half when we came to a place called Charleston in the Christian language. There they sold me to a small, weak, and wicked man called Johnson, a complete infidel who had no fear of God at all. The unhinging of things began for Ali Aisami Gazilmabe is a Kanuri. With the Fulani invasion of the Borno Empire and the destruction of the old Borno capital of Birnin Gazagamu, the impact of the conflicts registered most on families and individuals. The pressure of events was too strong for the Esami family. His parents died in quick succession, and to prevent the rest of the family from becoming destitute, his two young sisters were married to friends of the family. Not long afterwards, Ali fell into an ambush and was made into a slave. His misfortune is narrated with all the force and pathos of vernacular storytelling. He had been traveling from place to place in search of economic support since the war had ruined the family farm. Then greater misfortune struck him. After I had been there, meaning the town of Shago, 3 years, I called a companion saying, "Come and accompany me," for I had a friend in the town of the name of Guba. The youth arose and we started together. But as we were going towards the town of Guba, 7 Fulbe are also called Fulani or Fulata by the Kanuris, waylaid us, seized us, tied our hands upon our backs, fettered us, put us in the way, and then we went until it came day. On that day, some Hausa bought us, took us into a house, and put iron fetters on our feet. After marching a fortnight, we arrived at Birnin Yauri. Here the Hausa sold us and took their money. Took their goods. Well, Bogawo bought us. Bogawo are people of Borgu. The man who had bought me did not leave me alone at all. I had iron fetters round my feet, both by night and by day. After I had stayed with him 7 days, he took me and brought me to the town of Sai, where a Yoruba bought me. Dorugu. Dorugu's story is exactly the same as that of Ali Aisami. But Dorugu is Hausa, Ali is Kanuri. And it's the same war between the Sokoto Caliphate and the Borno Empire that produced these victims. One of them, Kanuri, on the side of the Borno people, and the other one, a Hausa, on the side of the Sokoto people. So the victims were everywhere. They were not limited to one group. The victims were all over the place. Now, Dorugu's story is very interesting. He was actually the most fortunate of the lot because his enslavement ended fairly quickly. Two German explorers, Barth and his companion, bought them. They bought them off the their cannery master, and set them free right away, and then took them to Europe, of course, ultimately. But they told their stories, and Dorugu's story is a classic now in Hausa. It's called Magana Hausa. Anybody who studies Hausa will read this as a given text, and it's very well written, a very, very well told story. Now, Dorugu ultimately came back to Nigeria and helped the British to establish their colonial outpost in the north. He acted as interpreter, and they also ran a school ultimately. Now, Dorugu's story, told in his Hausa language and titled Magana Hausa, is even more pathetic than Esami's. Like Esami, he and his family were caught up in the wars of empire between Sokoto and Borno. As an African proverb says, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. The people trapped in these wars were trampled abominably. Dorugu's family, like Esami's, disintegrated under the pressure of roving bands and fragments of the Borno army. First, his mother fell to an ambush, and his younger brother was given away by his father for safety. Dorugu's vernacular, unadorned style brings out the sadness and helplessness that pervaded life in those troubled times. At that time, he writes, there were still some cannery around, since not all who had made war on Kanche had gone away. When she, that's Darugu's mother, was on her way carrying the fura and her hoe, they ambushed her from behind some trees. They seized her and took her away. When my father heard the news, he told us, your mother has been captured. There is nothing we can do about it, but be patient and hope. Then he took my brother and gave him to a man from Tasawa to become like his own son. And he said to him, you needn't return my son to me until we meet again in the afterlife. Soon after, the hammer blow fell on Dorugu and the rest of his family. His town was infiltrated by units of an approaching army, and when the main body of the army arrived, the city fell without a struggle, and its inhabitants were captured and enslaved. And this is how Dorugu describes that final catastrophe. We heard the sound of the chief approaching with drums and horns. At the moment the guns were fired, all the strangers started to capture their hosts. My father had told me to go with him to a certain gate, but my head was all mixed up. I didn't know what to do, with the result that the Borno man who had been in my father's house finally caught me. The Hausa man captured my father, and someone else captured my father's wife. Although who it was, I don't know. All the children in the town were crying. Mothers were separated from their children, and husbands were separated from their wives, and thus we were led away. Dorugu presents every particle of the event as well as the fatalism that underlines the general attitudes of the people towards their predicament. I saw a friend of mine, he writes, riding on the back of his master's horse, and I called to him, do you see? We have become slaves. He replied, "There is nothing we can do except put our trust in God's works." When we arrived at the war camp, we dismounted. As I looked around, I saw my father's wife being led to the chief by a man with a knife in his hand. They brought some nuts for us, but we didn't eat anything. We weren't hungry because we were so unhappy. After they carried off everything from the town, they set it on fire. Chicken eggs were exploding like guns as the fire reached everywhere. The fire continued burning in the town even into the next day. Dorugu completes the story with, "We arrived in a big town and spent the night there. The next morning, they continued on with us to my grandmother's village called Kunduwoshe. I saw my grandmother standing in her house. When she saw me, her whole body trembled. She asked me, 'Where is Adamu?' I said, 'I don't know.' Then I simply said goodbye. As I went on, I was crying. I saw a pair of twins lying on the road. They were crying, but they were too young to talk. And then we arrived in Zindaba. Guns, machetes, fires, all are instruments of violence and destruction constantly brought into play in the era of the slave trade. All are calculated to generate terror and to break the will of the enslaved. Dorugu paints the all too familiar picture of a world in disarray, marked by the spoliation of towns and cities, and of the sowing of despondency in the hearts and souls of many people. The abandoned twins crying on a lonely road become an emblem of the insensitivity and helplessness that had overwhelmed the people. Unlike many ethnic groups in West Africa, the Hausa celebrate twins. To them, twins are good because they bring beneficent influences into the world. Abandonment of twins is, therefore, a sign that the social fabric itself had been torn apart. I remember when I was growing up in northern Nigeria, when a woman has twins, she would dress up properly and carry her twins, and she would be going around and greeting people. Yambiu Inagesheku, mother of twins, is greeting you, and everybody will be bringing gifts to her. Because by giving them gifts, you are also getting blessings from the twins, and so on. But at this time, twins just don't count. They are left at the wayside to die. Every one of these narrators deplores slavery and the slave trade, and everyone regards it as a personal tragedy that he should lose his freedom. Each complains that his fellow Africans were instrumental in depriving him or her of his or her human rights. They all register their sense of outrage in language that is often heightened by indignation. Equiano calls the black slavers, quote, "those sable destroyers of human rights." And Koguano says of his captors, "I must own to the shame of my countrymen that I was first kidnapped and betrayed by some of my own complexion, who were the first cause of my exile and slavery." While Omar ibn Said states in his laconic style, quote, "I reside in this our country," meaning the United States of America, "by reason of great necessity. Wicked men took me by violence and sold me to the Christians." There is bitterness in the heart of Wright as he observes concerning his captors and the destroyers of his city, quote, These people that raised up this war, they are not another nation. We are all one nation speaking one language. Some of the narratives contain unintentional irony. The authors do not seem to question the injustice of domestic slavery, but assume that slavery is part of the normal process of social differentiation arising from unequal fortunes in warfare. Thus, Equiano writes in his life, "Sometimes, indeed, we sold slaves to them, but they were only prisoners of war, or such among us as had been convicted of kidnapping or adultery and some other crimes, which we esteemed heinous." And Ayuba Suleiman could narrate how his father, hearing of an English ship at the Gambian River, sent him with two servants to attend him to sell 2 slaves and to buy pepper and some necessaries. The irony is doubly reinforced in Ayuba's case. Here was a man on a mission to have 2 of his fellow blacks sold into slavery, but who was himself surprised and sold by some others. So artless were the narrators that the irony in their narratives was often lost on them. But narrators are careful to stress the difference between domestic and transatlantic slavery. Those of them who spent their days of slavery in the West Indies and America, as well as in Africa, were quick to point out the severity with which slaves were treated in those regions and to contrast such severity with the relative humaneness of Africans towards their domestic slaves. Equiano, again, is most explicit in this regard. He defends Africans against the accusation and imputations of pro-slavery writers that they were brutal to their African slaves. He writes, "I must acknowledge in honor of those sable destroyers of human rights that I never met with any ill treatment or saw any offered to their slaves except tying them when necessary to keep them from running away." Equiano reports that not only did the domestic slaves in Africa work no harder than their owners, they ate the same food, wore the same clothing, and lived in identical houses. Some of them even had slaves of their own. Koguano states that the lot of slaves in Africa was better than in America and the West Indies. Quote, "So far as I can remember, some of the Africans in my country keep slaves, which they take in war or for debt. But those which they keep are well fed and good care is taken of them, and they are treated well. And as to their clothing, they differ according to the custom of the country. But I may safely say that all the poverty and misery that any of the inhabitants of Africa meet with among themselves is far inferior to those inhospitable regions of misery which they meet with in the West Indies, where their hard-hearted overseers have never regard to the laws of God or the life of their fellow men." Both Equiano and Koguano devote considerable portions of their books exposing, quote, "those inhospitable regions of misery represented by the slave trade and the American and West Indian slavery. Being both actively involved in the abolitionist movement and in close touch with African communities in America, the West Indies, and in Britain, they present views on slavery hallowed by experience and a crusading zeal. In the narratives of those whose expatriation ended in Africa, That's those people who were being shipped outward, but who were captured by the British captains, the naval patrol that was trying to stop slavery. These ones ended up in Sierra Leone, so they didn't go to the West Indies or to America. But even they noticed the difference between the way slaves were treated inside Africa and the way they were treated by Europeans. Even for the brief period they were in contact with them. And so Ali Aissami says, the people of the great vessel, he was being actually transported to Brazil, but was brought back and sent to Sierra Leone instead. The people of the great vessel were wicked. When we had been shipped, they took away all the small pieces of cloth which were on our bodies and threw them into the water. Then they took chains and fettered two together. We were all fettered around our feet, and all the oldest died of thirst, for there was no water. Every morning they had to take many and throw them into the water. Now Crowther, who complains against the state of barbarity in the hidden land of his country, also describes the harsh conditions under which slaves were transported by their white masters, conditions in which, quote, men and boys were chained with a chain of about 6 fathoms in length, thrust through an iron fetter on the neck of every individual and fastened at both ends with padlocks. Joseph Wright also adds his own vignette of horror as he describes how, quote, all the boys had ropes on their necks and all the men were bound with chains, about 50 persons in a row, so that no one could escape without the others. And how, quote again, at one time the town of Lagos took fire and about 50 slaves were consumed because the entry was crowded. Now, once the African wars, skirmishes, and kidnapping raids with their attendant brutalities are disentangled from the actual treatment of slaves in the African homes, it becomes credible that African domestic slavery was conspicuously more humane than slavery in the white plantations and households of America. And this difference is also reflected by the methods of compelling submission in the two places. The pervading symbols of slavery were the implements of constraint, the rope, the iron chain, the manacle, the fetter, the padlock, and the iron muzzle, not to mention the ghastly instruments of punishment and torture, which were employed to keep the Africans submissive. The refinement of these instruments rose with the degree of technological development, from the simple rope of the African kidnappers to the most ingenious inventions which American technology could throw up. One of the most unforgettable pictures from the narratives is the African woman with the iron muzzle whom Ekwano encountered cooking a meal in a Virginian plantation. She is described as follows. The poor creature was cruelly loaded with various kinds of iron machines. She had one particularly on her head, which locked her mouth so fast that she could scarcely speak and could not eat nor drink. The contrivance was called the iron muzzle. More disabling, perhaps, than the fetters of slavery were the separation and uprooting of individuals from their groups and communities, and from well-known scenes and familiar terrains to strange places and hostile environments. In Africa, where a sense of community has always been a dominant principle of society and social organization, an individual's feeling of well-being is necessarily related to his or her close integration with parents, brothers, sisters, friends, and neighbors. For this reason, also, feelings of tragic abandonment and traumatic alienation were experienced by Africans at those points and in those instances in which they were torn away from their communities and relations. Their narratives soar to high peaks of emotive resonance when they talk about their separation from their relations and communities, the shattering of the harmonious world of childhood, and the dissolution of the familiar primary ties. And this rhetoric also reveals some gradations of response from mild sensations and surprises to full-blown expressions of horror mixed with outrage. Reflecting that deep sense of injury occasioned by separation, Crowther bemoans his wrenching from his smoldering city as he and other luckless inhabitants were dragged into slavery. His cry was significantly that of a child of the ancestral tradition, haunted by the terror of dying away from home and being buried away from the ancestral hearth. Farewell, place of my birth, the playground of my childhood, and the place which I thought would be the repository of my mortal body in its old age. The narrators with traditionalist backgrounds like Crowther, Equiano, Coguano, Wright, felt the terror of exile made concrete by the physical separation from their ancestral base. The Muslims, Ayuba Suleiman, Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, Ali Aisemi, Omar ibn Said, Salih Bilaili, also experienced the sadness of separation, but the terror was of a different kind, not ancestral, since Islam, being a universalistic religion, had already extended the psychic horizon of its adherents. The Muslims experienced the terror of being trapped in a world completely dominated by Christian infidels. In either case, those concerned suffered a measure of alienation from the moment they were removed from people and surroundings within which they were originally integrated. There was a morbidity of feeling which drove many of the people to suicide or to fits of depression, the like to which every narrator gives utterance. Relief came temporarily with chance meetings of relatives, as for example, Equiano's unexpected reunion with his sister, and Crowther's with his mother and two nephews. Such reunions eased the pain of separation, but were followed with redoubled pain since they were destined to be broken up again at some subsequent divergence of their owners' interests. All other forms of identity, in addition to kinship, became more precious. Identity of language, culture, and religion became precious as people left the ancestral homeland, kin, friends, and neighbors. Even identity of color became important the moment the African exiles came into a world of white people. They became acutely aware of their Africanness and their blackness insofar as they began increasingly to encounter the burdensome impositions of the white man in the plantations and households. For purposes of survival, new bonds and group feelings were created in place of old ones, but these took time to germinate and take root. For the present, the feeling of dismay at the dissolution of old associations and certainties caused the greatest emotional storms in the hearts of the African exiles. Equiano's indignation reflects the sort of feeling most Africans express in a variety of ways at the point of their enforced expatriation. O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice? Are the dearest friends and relations now rendered more dear by their separation from their kindred, still to be parted from each other, and thus prevented from sharing the gloom of slavery with the small comfort of being together and mingling their sufferings and sorrows? Why are the parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, or husbands their wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors even to the wretchedness of slavery. A new refinement in cruelty is a fitting phrase, just as fitting as Koguano's inhospitable regions of misery. Both phrases felicitously describe a condition which challenged, even when contemplated in the abstract, the entire basis of humane religiosity, humanistic philosophy, and enlightened ethics. A positive aspect was, however, always there. The victims did not turn their faces to the wall, nor did they accept the overrunning of their humanity. They kept up a lively resistance by opposing their spirits to the negative forces of oppression. Thank you.
Yes, my question has to do with something I've been pondering in a completely different context. And that is the issue of trauma and the many discussions of trauma that have come from it, especially since the First World War, post-traumatic stress disorder. But not so much post-traumatic stress disorder as post-traumatic contagion. That is to say, the degree to which ordinary, mundane details of everyday life get intensified with a certain traumatic potential. So for children who have undergone trauma, a fear of darkness, for example, or fear of strangers, and so on. Now, from your accounts, one trope that you kept returning to all the time was the description of the devastation and destruction of towns. All of them seem to be concerned with the decimation of the town. What I wanted to find out from you is, in their accounts, are there any moments when they seem also to describe a certain, so to say, a breach in the commonplace, to say, a certain nervousness about something completely ordinary? My bigger question is, are there signs that predate the heightening of descriptions of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic contagion? Can we discern signs of some of these things, post-traumatic contagion, etc., in these accounts of slave narratives? And if not, why? If not, why is it that there's no signals of post-traumatic contagion in these slave narratives? Because it's obvious that if there isn't, why not? So post-traumatic contagion, and if there's no post-traumatic contagion in the accounts, why is there? What can account for this absence?
kind of therapy. They're trying to inscribe their humanity, which have been trampled. By telling the story, they're trying to rehumanize themselves. As I go forward to the other lectures, I'll bring out the other aspects, the aspects of the past, which may be painful, but still they need it to revalidate their sense of humanity in the present. These people are, the limited interest they have here is to tell a story. They're not self-analytical people. They are not saying, they're not standing apart from themselves and analyzing their states of mind. They're not doing that, even though they do respond to situations. And their language can tell you whether the level of their outrage or, that sort of thing. But the post-traumatic stress and saying, oh, I am afraid of the dark, or I'm afraid of something, I'm responding to the experience I've had by being, allergic to milk or something like that. That's way beyond, you now dealing with the novelistic, the kind of self-preening, self-analysis that only trained writers would yes?
I was wondering if there was any major difference in the narratives from men as compared with women. Women, was there any difference between the male narratives and the female narratives? Because the ones that you cited seem to be all men.
Well, the ones I have worked with are mainly men. I'll get to Phyllis Whitley, who is doing the narrative also, but in poetic form. She's telling her own story. She's pursuing the same line, but with so she talks about slavery in other contexts. She writes letters. She discusses through her in more prosaic forms. She deals with slavery, but she also deals with it in poetic form. Her position is more or less like the others, really. Do you think they ought to be maybe a ban or something? As far as in the female.
Oh no, I just wondered if they had a different representation of their experience, either because they were treated differently, or whether they thought about it in different ways. I'm very ignorant about this, so this is why I'm asking you if there was a major difference.
Yeah, I wish they were, because in many cases, women's matters are they are presented, but in this case, suffering has no gender, I suspect suffering is suffering. Many of the people who suffer most palpably were women, because for one thing, in that kind of rough and tumble situation, the men will fight a war, they get killed, or they may run away, but sometimes they are also victims because they're ambushed. Even strong stalwarts like Ayuba was ambushed. He couldn't get access to his weapons, so he fell to an ambush. And everybody can, when they are surprised, you can actually be kidnapped and smuggled out of the place and sold. In fact, among these people, there's really no gradation here, and I don't even think there's gender there. All fell by the same hand. You have princes who were enslaved. You had scholars who were enslaved. Real scholars who gone through the rigor of Islamic, training. And they were enslaved. You had everybody. In fact, in Igbo land, the people who were the titled people, very proud people, they were enslaved. And if you read the literature, among the other slaves, they will be bowing to them. And the slave captives were really quite aghast. Why should everybody be bowing to this little man? He's no different from others. But people looked at him, this is a titled man. An essay. Good heavens. And so they were fetching and carrying for him, even within the context of slavery, and bowing to him. And those ones just committed suicide when they had the earliest opportunity. Because rather than go into slavery, they would terminate their lives. The British thought that if you bought such people, you have had bad luck. He says they would espouse every strategy to terminate their lives. And it's because these were people of dignity, and their dignity had been violated, and they'd rather go. And so they would take any opportunity available to terminate their lives. Slavery, it leveled down everybody. Yes?
I really enjoyed your talk, and one of the things I think you mentioned is something, is sort of the slaveless canard, that by the 18th century, some slavers, or slave traders, are saying that slavery is really humanitarian for the slave trade, because it takes off excess. And that Africans would have killed the captives anyway. And so by the 1730s, you have large arguments saying it really is good for Africa, humanitarian slavery. And it seems to me, though, that abolitionists come up with a counter argument to the canard, which is to say that slavery in Africa in general is familial and domestic. What I'm saying, when you move large numbers of people, you cannot.
In internal stripes.
Yeah.
No, in terms of African slavery to the Mideast and
Indeed.
Far East.
Oh, yeah, the Middle East one is just mind-boggling. They were going through the desert. They were going from Tripoli to Canada.
Walking.
Well, they were going on camelbacks and so on. But they got to set some of these oases, and they found bones of people who perished. Obviously, the Middle Passage can talk about that. Because the evidence, yes, it's been documented and so on. The Guano is very graphic in describing what really happened.
Well, what do you think about Vincent Corretta's claim that Equiano, it's not a claim. I examined the documents. Equiano, in two places, says he was born in South Carolina.
No, that's all. I did a short play.
Huh? You did a play?
A small play. I wrote a play, just laughing at the idea that he was born in South Carolina. Look, I have done a very detailed study of Iguana. There are 7 Igbo words in Equiano's narrative. No other person, no person who was not an Igbo.
Yeah, but London was full of Africans.
Excuse me.
There were other Africans in London. There are other ways he could.
So he could have gotten those information.
Sure, of course he could. But that's not my question. I mean, I agree with you. You know that. But you didn't answer the question, which is this.
Yes.
Why would Equiano say he was from South Carolina? That won't go away. In two places, Equiano identified his birthplace as South Carolina.
Himself. We do not know.
We don't know.
Even the evidence, Vincent Carretta's evidence.
Right.
In those lists in the records,
Right. The naval records.
in the naval records, you find that there were variants. This man was named Gustavus Vasa.
Mm-hmm.
You could actually spell that. But Gustav Weston, the difference between Vasa, V-A-S-A or V-A-S-S-A, and Weston is just as distant as something is from. I don't want to use the word, but I have ways of saying it.
Okay. So you do not accept it?
No. The point. No, these were not just failing in spelling, or that the British are allergic to foreign words.
But you could have gotten Igbo words from other Africa. I mean, his best friends were.
There are things.
He hung around with.
No,
all these guys hung around together. They drank tea together all day long.
The evidence, the linguistic evidence, and the evidence from the way of life, the ethnographic. It's so intimate. He describes a thing, an experience that I myself had as a child. His home is less than 20 miles as the crow flies from my own home.
We think. We don't know exactly.
We know. We know as certainty. He spells.
I won't tease you.
No, I have written a longish.
If he will admit that he was born in South Carolina,
No.
how would it change? In what ways would it change the general argument?
No, this is the argument. This is what people say.
No, he said
That was a woman.
He said if it's true.
If it's true, I'm not saying
If you said that,
Yeah, if it were true.
If it were true, let's speculate that it is true that he was born in South Carolina. How would it affect the general argument and understanding about it?
all right. That was a young woman. I don't know whether she was young, but she wrote a letter to me. She'd written to Skip at Canterbury, moved down to Vincent Carretta, and then in conspiracy they had moved her out to me. And, so in the end I had to do a long piece to really, it's coming out in research in African literature. Just to put paint to all this argument. That thing, it really infuriates me because see, Equiano has left all the signposts within his story to make sure he wasn't even thinking about academic skeptics who come in the 20th century to that 200 years after to question his identity. But he did in fact leave all the signposts. And I think that's why I said, I owe it to him, just me, my little self, to make sure that all the, he was.
I hope you're right, Emmanuel. I hope you're right. You know that.
No,
I don't want to lose another brother.
I have no doubt at all. I have no doubt at all. When you read my stuff, you will, I'm sure, come to the same conclusion.
Can we get one final question, maybe, Emmanuel N?
Patrick Manning has done some, a long time ago, did some really important historical work where he looked at the statistical evidence for the ages of people, and this is particularly in Dahomey, and sort of concretizing on the ground the impact of the actual slave raids on the population there. And some of the data that he provides has to do with costs and values of particular sexes and ages of individuals. And I'm wondering if one were to look at the historical data from these periods and particular places against the narrative versions of the same, if one would be able to see the ways in which some of these stories are reflecting some of the more emotionally trying aspects and in what ways they've been shaped vis-a-vis the historical record. And then my second question was framed from the vantage of the more northerly aspects of the West African slave trade from Mali through Nigeria, and wondering the impact of, let's say, the 18th and 19th century Fulani movement that brought together the former slaves of these areas against their one-time captors and owners in a broad-based political rebellion. If that provided a certain sense of emotional or psychological expiation that gave a different sense to the situation in those areas than perhaps was the case in further south, where the trade was much more closely allied with European slavery context. In other words, if you can divide West Africa across the more northerly savanna belt from the forest areas with respect to the impact.
In fact, it's hard to really concretize that, but I have a feeling, it's only a feeling, but that slavery devastated the northern part a lot more than the southern part.
Yeah, it was huge, but I just meant the response to it. They were able to have a political response to it in the form of the Fulani Jihads, and if that had an impact from the vantage of the enduring issue of traumas that you brought out at the beginning.
Yeah, well, the political aspect, Islam is a major mitigating factor in the northern part. Actually, the surprise is that some of the slaves came from that area. I thought they would all go across the desert. That was meant to be across the desert. But some of them managed to be brought down to the south. But Islam, as a religion, actually forbade slavery, the enslavement of the faithful. That if you are an Orthodox Muslim, that should show you up against being enslaved. But it didn't always work, because a good many of these people were Muslims, and they were practicing Muslims. The religion itself says you should not enslave a believer, especially if that believer is also able to read the Quran. If he can't read, he obviously is gay. I really don't understand why that distinction, but it's there. And yet, a good many of these people were actually literate in Arabic, and they still were enslaved. If the sensitivity I can distinguish is that level, that the religion itself is quite clear on who should be enslaved. It's the infidels. But in reality, the faithful got enslaved. In the South, it's almost, the thing is just almost open-ended. The political system is based on, well, if you are conquered, if you are defeated in warfare, and you are enslaved, then you have to work for your enslavers or for your captors. But the important thing here is that up in the north you are protected. You have legal protection. In the south you didn't have legal protection. That's the only distinction I can really make. But having said that, victims are victims, whether they were up in the north or down in the south, because they suffered the same fate. They all got sold if they were captured, if they were defeated in the war. Or the actual part of it, which is controversial, is kidnapping. In many of the southern areas, kidnapping is a crime. And it's a very serious crime. And many people who were found guilty of kidnapping were sold into slavery. That's how serious that crime was. Up in the north, in the northern part, in the Savannah region. Now, why I said the Savannah region probably produced more victims, or a lot more, was that because of the nature of the vegetation. This is grassland, this Savannah region. And people could enslave you by riding on the horseback. And the warfare was based on horse riding. So there were more victims. You could actually overrun a place fairly quickly. In the south, with the thick forests, you had cover. It was not that easy to completely defeat an army in the forest. People disappeared into the forest if things got rough. Whereas in the Savannah area, it was easy to overrun a whole large territory, and so on. But the political sensitivity you're talking about is there. Sometimes it's there just nominally, but it's not followed. This period was a period of lawlessness. I really think that laws didn't hold much water. What held water was how much you were able to defend yourself. Yes, it was a matter of either you were able to protect yourself or you went on.